Hey everyone, welcome to yet another episode of GenAI Vlog. So previous episode, we talked about this state machine. A state machine is essentially a workflow that you created using step function. So once it's created, it will take this workflow as it is, and it will execute it as desired. So it will essentially be a very helpful tool to knit together a couple of Lambda functions to execute pretty much whatever you want. So we talked about that in previous episode, and in this episode, I want to show you guys how to essentially invoke this entire thing and get the response back in one API call. So hopefully this makes everything easier for your end user, whether the end user is developer or your colleague on your team or someone from the product side, so on and so forth. So with that being said, let's get started with what's going on in this current workflow. So this current workflow, we start with a choice. The choice checks the condition. The condition is defined as check the input type. In this case, the input type can be purchase. That will route you to this Lambda function here called purchase handler, or the type can be refund. So as was stated here, refund. If it's a refund, it will route you to the second Lambda function, refund handler. The outcome of purchase handler and refund handler will then hit the result handler and it will display something back. Like, for example, this can be a SNS or something like that that you can broadcast within your team to show that this workflow has been executed correctly with certain JSON output. So with that being said, that is the definition of this current workflow. Now let me just quickly test it just so that everyone's on the same page. So to do that, let me go to my state machines, and then let me start an execution. Here, I am going to put in type in the key of this JSON payload, and then I am going to say purchase, and then it will trigger the first route, right? So it will start execution, and then it will hit choice. Choice is going to check the condition, and it should hit the first Lambda function, purchase handler, and then result handler, and then the output, so on and so forth. The event is going to show up down here. Great. And everything is correct. So that makes me feel better. And then these steps are also presented. So I know that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So as another example, we can then do a new execution. Instead of purchase, here we hit refund, which is the other direction. So start execution. It's going to check the condition. And then once it checks the condition, it should say refund. It's going to hit refund handler. And then it's going to show us the result. Same thing. The steps are presented here. And you can see that it's doing what it's supposed to do. Great. So now we know that this is doing what we want to do, and we know that this is already a well-defined state machine. Then let's go ahead and create our own Lambda function so that we can hit this entire workflow altogether. So let's go to our Lambda function, and then let's say create a Lambda function. In this case, I want to be able to talk to this specifically, so I'm going to grab this name, and then I am going to create a Lambda function based on that name. So this is a Lambda invoke, and then let me make sure Lambda invoke is in the beginning. So this naming convention hopefully makes sense to me and my team. I'm going to set as Python as the main language. Okay, so that's the Lambda function. Let's hit create. So this is going to create a Lambda function. Now, what needs to happen is let's make sure that we have the script here that actually execute the step function entirely as a whole. And when we execute it, we want to use the star sync execution. So not only are we invoking the entire step function, we are also getting the response back. So I already have the Lambda function design. Let me paste it here. That's a Lambda function. And you can see that we use Bolo3. That's the client step functions. That's how it's defined. And in the Lambda handler, we have the header just to make sure we have the core set up correctly. This is in the case that your function is going to an API that front-end developers are using Java-based application. So with that being said, that's the header. In the try except statement, we grab the body. We dump that body in the JSON payload. In that instance, we can then use it in the step function client. We use the star sync execution. And of course, here we need to send in the step function ARN. And then this also means that in the Lambda configuration, we need to define this as an environment variable. Otherwise, this is not going to get anything back. So this is kind of like by itself an invocation of another service on AWS console, which means this Lambda function need to be allowed for the appropriate policy so that you can call or execute a step function. All right, so we're going to talk about that next. And then whatever the output is, you get the JSON response back and you dump it out. So hopefully this will work. Let's save it and then let's deploy it. Once it's deployed, let's make sure the configuration is correct. First things first, let's go to configuration and then let's check in the environment variable. Obviously here we need to create an environment variable. Notice that the variable name is step function ARN. So let's grab that. It's a case sensitive. So let's hit edit. Let's add environment variable. Let's put the key there. And then let's come back to our state machine. And then let's grab the ARN, which is this giant monster here. So let's copy that. And let's assign it here as the value. So once that's there, let's hit save. The environment variable should be updated. Now let's make sure the Lambda function has the permission. So let's go into this IAM role for the Lambda function. And then let's make sure that you can actually call or invoke step function or state machine. So let's attach your policy and then let's search step function. And then for simplicity, I'm just going to hit full access, add permission, and hopefully that should be all set. So once that's added, you're good to go. Now you come back to Lambda function, and then all we need is a payload. Let's add a test event. We can give a name, test1. And then here we're going to say is add a payload here. So we know that the payload is type. So here we're going to say type. And then let's give a value here to be purchase. Okay, so let's hit save and then let's invoke it to see what's going on. So here we actually get a non-type. So let's try debug this. I think there's a type issue in regards to this. So I think what's going on here is in the type, precisely if type is not in the body, that's what's happening. So let's try to fix that. And let's update this chunk of code to make sure that it reads the body. And once it's done, let's hit invoke and let's see what's going on. Okay, so we got an error say error is occurred when calling star-sync execution operation. Operation is not supported by this type of state machine. So I think in this case, it means that this operation is actually trying to execute, but because the step function is not expressed, so unfortunately, this star-sync execution doesn't work on this particular state machine. So let's try to come back here, and then let's try to turn this into an express format. So as we can see here, this is standard, it's not express. So unfortunately, this star-sync execution doesn't work with that setup. So let's go to state machine, and then let's create a new one with the express setup. So this is my state machine test2, and then we're going to use express. Let's hit continue. So let's start with a workflow. Number one, it's the choice. And then we need to put the actions in here. Here is AWS Lambda. Let's set it there. We have another Lambda. Let's set it here. And then we have a third Lambda that is down here. And then I want to make sure this Lambda 1 points to second Lambda. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to point the next state to Lambda invoke 2. There we go. And then the choice has rules. So this is rules. I can pretty much just take what I have before. And in this case, I am using the type. And if type is purchase, that's going to hit the first Lambda. And the first Lambda, it's called purchase handler. So let me type it here, purchase handler. And it's going to point to the function purchase handler. So purchase handler, that's the latest version of the Lambda. There you go. Now there's a condition for the second direction of the choice. In this case, I can copy paste the previous one here directly for the second condition. Let's make sure this rule has a condition to be refound. And if it's a refound, it will take you to the next Lambda function, which is refound. So here we're going to say refound handler. That's the next state. And that's the next condition. So you have two conditions as what we defined above. The last thing is a result handler. So let me change the name to result handler. And in this case, it is going to point to the Lambda function result handler. There you go. That should be all set. The next state is to go into the end. So let's test this and let's just make sure everything is correct. If it's a refund, it will hit refund. And if it's purchase, start test, you will hit purchase. Great, so now everything's defined. Now let's hit create. This will create an IAM role along with a group in CloudWatch. So now that this is created, you can see that this state machine is expressed, and that means I can invoke it in the Lambda function altogether as a whole call. So let's exit out this, and then let's make sure we can test it out here, just to make sure everything is working correctly. So type, let's send purchase, and let's say that's my payload. So I'm going to say start execution. It will hit choice. It will come to the left-hand side, hit result handler, and all the steps are doing what it's supposed to do. Great. Now let's test out the other direction. So this is going to be refund. That's a value for the type. Let's start execution, and it should hit the second Lambda function. So let's take a look. Hit the second Lambda function. Boom, done. And all the steps are laid out here. Refund, result, and it's doing what it's supposed to do. Great. So let's grab this ARN. This is going to be a new ARN, and this time it's an express version. Here it says express. So let's make sure we got this correct. So in this value for the step function, what's happening here is I actually got rid of the express, and then I have to put a state machine in return. So this ARN somehow didn't work for me. I have to replace this express with state machine. And once I did that, and I hit save, this environment variable worked for me. So let's go to the code, and then let's hit the other direction. So let's say this is refund, and hopefully I'll get something back that says refund. So let's invoke it. 200, that means it's correct. Purchase process successful, and then the result here is a refund. So there you go, you get the idea. Now this Lambda function works, right? This Lambda function works, and then we know that it's working, and here's a test event. Awesome. So now let's front it with a trigger, and the trigger is going to be none other than API gateway. So let's create a new API. Let's create a REST API. Let's make sure security is open. Let's hit add. This is going to create an API as a trigger. The goal is to be able to invoke this Lambda using an invoke URL. So once it's created, let's hit trigger. Let's click on the API gateway button. It will take me to this particular resource. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it a secure way. So I am going to, I'll just test it first, and then I'm going to hit post. Here I'm going to send in a payload, and the payload says type. Here it says purchase. And we know what that's going to do. It's going to hit one of the Lambda function and then give us some sort of response back. Boom, 200. That means it's working correctly. And then somewhere down here, yeah, it's executing correctly, and we got some response back. Great, purchase, it says here. Awesome. So we know that this payload is correct, and we know how it works, and this is the post method. Great, now I'm going to deploy it, but before I do that, I'm going to make the API key require. So I'm going to hit API key require, hit save, and then I'm going to deploy this, but in this case, I actually need to create a usage plan along with an API key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to usage plan, and then I'm going to go to basic API tutorial, and then I'm going to associate a stage with this usage plan. And this usage plan actually has a basic API key here for basic tutorial that I created on YouTube. So before I do that, let me deploy this. And then I'm going to choose a stage, just say dev, and say deploy. This is going to physically deploy an API, and then I can hit this invoke URL. But of course, I need a key, right? So let's associate this with a key. Here, I'm going to say invoke my state machine, Lambda invoke my state machine #1, and the stage here is dev. There you go. So add usage plan. So that add this stage, which is that API, to this usage plan. And then this associated API is going to be this particular one. Awesome. So now I should have everything in place. What I'm going to do is I am going to grab this invoke URL, and then I'm going to go to my Postman, put it here as my invoke URL, and that's going to be a post request. So let's make sure that's correct. And then I am going to show you without API key what's supposed to happen. So in this case, I'm going to send in a payload. Here says type, and then the value here says purchase. If I hit enter, it should not be giving me anything back. It says forbidden. That makes perfect sense because I did not enter API key, right? I go to my header, there's no key in here. So this API call, it's stopped. Great. So I need to grab my API key. So what that means is I need to go to associate API key, grab this API key, and then put that in the header. And the thing that you put in is X API key. And then you can just assign API key here as a value. Now, in this case, it's a test case. So everyone on YouTube can see it. There's no problem. In your case, obviously, you don't want to expose your API key to the internet. So that being said, let's go to my body. That's there. And I can hit send again. So take a couple of tries for the API to take into effect. But here we go. You hit send again. And here I got a JSON response back. Great. I can then check refund. And I hit send again. It will say refund process successfully. Awesome. So now this is working. And we know that the API call is working because of 200 code, because of the output. Now let's also check in the console on AWS to make sure that we have a traceability, right? Someone's hitting our API call, we better have traceability. So how that works is, first of all, you can go to your Lambda, you can go to your monitor, and if someone's hitting your API call, obviously you're supposed to see it here, right? That's like the number one thing you can see here. Another thing you can see here is go to the exact Lambda function inside of the step function to see if you can see something there. So for example, I have purchase handler here. I have a result handler. I have a refund handler here. I have a result handler here. If I go to result handler, you're also supposed to see something happen, right? If I hit monitor, you're also supposed to see something happening here. That makes sense, right? Because someone's hitting your API, so they better be showing up here. So if I go to CloudWatch for the result handler, it should be able to show me what's happening here on the API call. So I can click in the most recent one. Let me expand it. Here the results are here, right? So everything should be very clear. And then last but not least, you should of course be able to see all of that in your state machine. So if I go to state machine and then I go to monitor, and something is supposed to show up here, right? If someone's hitting your API, it's supposed to show up here. You can go to CloudWatch, have traceability there, and then you can also hit logging, so on and so forth. You get the idea. So this is awesome, guys. Hopefully in this episode, we showed you how to put together a step function that's Express version, and how do you have a step function to invoke a couple of different lambdas. And you can also front that entire step function with a Lambda function, and then you can front that Lambda function with an API, and then you can hit that API using Postman. So this essentially allow anyone on the internet, obviously they have to have an API key, right, to hit that API and to go to Lambda functions that you designed. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and like.